June 13, 1943, above the gray clouds of northern France. The sky is alive with engine roar and tracer fire. Below, a formation of American bombers crawls through the haze, sunlight glinting off their silver skins. High above, Luftwaffe pilots circle, confident, predatory, the self-proclaimed masters of European skies. One of them, Oberleutnant Karl Fischer, spots a single American fighter breaking formation far below. It looks enormous, bloated, heavy, almost clumsy. He smirks. Amerikanische Technik, he mutters through his oxygen mask, rolling his Messerschmitt Bf 109 into a dive. But as he closes the distance, the lumbering shape suddenly tilts, nose down, plunging with impossible speed. The roar changes pitch, deeper, hungrier. The German's instruments tremble as he dives after it. Then, before he can blink, the big American turns upward. 8 flashes erupt from its wings, a storm of 50 caliber fire slicing through the sky. Fischer's canopy shatters. The laughter in his headset turns to silence. Below, the new American fighter levels off, its massive engine thundering as it climbs back toward the clouds. That day, German pilots stopped laughing at the P-47 Thunderbolt. When America entered the Second World War in December 1941, its air power was still young, confident but untested. Across the Atlantic, the Luftwaffe reigned supreme, seasoned by years of combat from the Blitzkrieg in Poland to the skies over London. The U.S. Army Air Forces, USAF, faced a brutal reality. If their heavy bombers were to strike Germany itself, they would need a fighter capable of surviving deep into enemy airspace. In early 1942, American fighter pilots were flying P-40 Warhawks, P-39 Airacobras, and early model P-38 Lightnings. They were adequate for short-range engagements, but in the high-altitude, long-range missions demanded by Europe's geography, they struggled. Bombers like the B-17 and B-24 could reach Germany, but their escorts could not, and without protection they were slaughtered. The Air Force needed something new, something big, something powerful enough to climb with the bombers, fight off interceptors, and still make it home. That challenge fell to Republic Aviation, led by the brilliant and stubborn designer Alexander Kartveli. He envisioned a fighter unlike any before, not nimble like a Spitfire, but a brute force machine that relied on speed, altitude, and raw firepower. His answer, the P-47 Thunderbolt. The Thunderbolt was colossal. Nearly the size of a light bomber, it weighed twice as much as a Spitfire. Its heart was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder air-cooled radial engine that produced over 2,000 horsepower. But the true secret was behind the engine, a complex turbo supercharger system, fed through ductwork that wound through the fuselage. It gave the P-47 unmatched performance at extreme altitudes, where the air was thin and the bombers flew. When the first prototype flew in May 1941, test pilots were both thrilled and terrified. The plane was fast, over 400 miles per hour, but its sheer bulk made takeoffs and landings a delicate dance. Many early pilots feared the Jug, as it was nicknamed. Its long nose blocked visibility, and its landing speed was dangerously high. Yet in the air it moved like a predator. By 1942, production began in earnest. The United States was gearing up for all-out war, and Republic's factory in Farmingdale, New York, worked day and night. The Thunderbolt rolled off the lines in shining aluminum rows, each armed with 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, 4 on each wing, a storm of lead capable of shredding a bomber or a train alike. But as America shipped its first squadrons overseas, doubts remained. Many within the Air Force believed the P-47 was too heavy to dogfight, too complex to maintain, and too fuel-hungry to escort bombers to Germany. When the first P-47 units, including the 56th Fighter Group, arrived in England in early 1943, British pilots watched with skeptical amusement. The Thunderbolt dwarfed their sleek Spitfires. One Royal Air Force officer joked, "It looks like it's carrying its own hangar." The Americans, eager but inexperienced, trained in the cloudy skies of East Anglia. They learned to handle the Thunderbolt's tremendous dive speed, its brutal acceleration, and its sluggish climb. For weeks, the Luftwaffe ignored them, until the new fighter began to appear over the French coast. That was when the laughter began, from the other side. German intelligence officers, After examining captured photos, dismissed the P-47 as a clumsy elephant. Luftwaffe pilots nicknamed it the milk bottle because of its fat fuselage and round engine cowling. They believed no such machine could turn or climb fast enough to threaten a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf, but they were wrong, dangerously wrong. The Thunderbolt wasn't built to turn. It was built to dive, strike, and vanish, a concept no German pilot had faced before. And soon in the skies over occupied Europe, they would learn what American firepower really meant. By the spring of 1943, the P-47 Thunderbolt was officially in combat over Europe. The 4th, 56th, and 78th fighter groups took to the skies from airfields scattered across southern England, Debden, Halesworth, and Duxford. Each squadron was learning how to fight a new kind of war, and the aircraft itself was still an enigma even to those flying it. Early missions were plagued with issues. The turbo supercharger system, brilliant in design but complex in practice, often malfunctioned. Pilots reported sudden power losses at altitude, engine surges, and even cockpit fires. Mechanics worked tirelessly to understand the labyrinth of pipes and ducts that wound through the Thunderbolt's body like arteries. And then there was range, the single biggest problem. The P-47 could escort bombers only part of the way into France before turning back for fuel. Once the Thunderbolts returned home, the B-17s and B-24s were left exposed to the full fury of the Luftwaffe. Every week more bombers failed to return. Still, the Americans persisted. They refined their tactics, adjusted their flight formations, and learned how to use the Thunderbolt's strengths rather than fight its weight. Pilots discovered that above 25,000 feet, few German fighters could match its speed or stability. Its turbocharged engine thrived where others gasped for oxygen. The first real combat came in April 1943, during bomber raids over Rouen and Saint-Omer. The Luftwaffe responded with waves of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s, sleek, lethal machines that had dominated Europe since 1940. But now they met something entirely different. Reports from German pilots reveal their surprise. The Thunderbolt, which looked so slow from a distance, could dive like a falling star. Its immense weight turned into an advantage, whereas in a dive, gravity was its ally. P-47s routinely reached speeds over 500 miles per hour, and when they pulled out, their wings held together while German fighters risked tearing apart. Still, early encounters were mixed. The P-47 was fast, but its short range meant it could not linger in combat. Dogfighting against experienced Luftwaffe aces was risky, and many Thunderbolt squadrons suffered initial losses. American pilots had to learn to fight smart, using altitude, surprise, and firepower. It was Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding officer of the 56th Fighter Group, who began shaping a new kind of aerial warfare. Zemke understood that the Thunderbolt was not a knife for close duels. It was a hammer. He trained his men to attack from above, strike hard, and break away before the enemy could react. His doctrine, the boom and zoom, became the gospel of P-47 squadrons. Meanwhile, the Thunderbolt's firepower began to prove itself in terrifying fashion. Those 8 Browning 50 caliber guns could deliver over 12,000 rounds per minute, turning enemy aircraft into flaming wrecks with a single burst. German pilots who once mocked the Jug soon began to fear it. After each mission, returning Luftwaffe crews reported that the American fighter could take hits that would destroy any other plane. That toughness was legendary. Pilots came back with bullet holes in their wings, oil leaking from engines, and flaps shredded. Yet the P-47 refused to die. One Thunderbolt reportedly returned to base with a cylinder missing from its engine, another with a 3-foot section of wing gone. For men flying long missions over enemy territory, that meant survival. By mid-1943, the laughter had quieted. The Luftwaffe began to adapt, but it was already too late. American industry was flooding the skies with Thunderbolts, hundreds every month, and the tactical balance was shifting. The P-47 was no longer an experiment. It was becoming a symbol, a machine built not for elegance but endurance, not to dazzle, but to dominate. And as the Allies prepared for the next stage of the air war, the massive daylight raids deep into Germany, the Thunderbolt would stand at the heart of the battle. Because soon, it wouldn't just be a fighter, it would become a legend. Every great weapon of war has more than one story. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not just a machine. It was an ecosystem of metal, fuel, courage, and human adaptation. To understand why the Luftwaffe's laughter turned to fear, we must look at the Thunderbolt from every angle, from the cockpit, the factory floor, and even through the eyes of its enemies. To sit in a P-47 was to feel like part of a living engine. The cockpit was cramped but oddly reassuring, wrapped in thick armor plates and humming with power. When pilots fired up the R-2800 Double Wasp, the aircraft didn't just start, it awakened. The sound was a deep, resonant growl that shook the ground and vibrated through the pilot's bones. Inside, the pilot faced a maze of dials and switches. The turbo supercharger control system, the boost lever, and the propeller governor all demanded coordination. Rookie pilots sometimes fought the plane more than the enemy. Yet once mastered, the Thunderbolt became a trusted companion, a machine that would protect its pilot at any cost. American pilots came to love their jug. They knew it could take punishment and still bring them home. In combat debriefings, they often described hearing bullets hammering against the fuselage, only to find after landing that the armor had absorbed most of it. That toughness became psychological armor as well. Pilots grew bolder, more aggressive. They began to believe they could survive anything, and often they did. From an engineering perspective, the Thunderbolt was a masterpiece of brute force innovation. The R-2800 engine produced more horsepower than any Allied single-engine fighter in 1943. But its true genius was in the General Electric turbo supercharger, which allowed it to maintain full power at 30,000 feet, far above the reach of most Luftwaffe fighters. The system compressed thin, high-altitude air, forcing more oxygen into the engine and maintaining performance where German aircraft suffocated. The complex ducting added weight, but it gave the Thunderbolt one defining advantage: speed in the dive. While a Spitfire or Bf-109 could turn inside it, none could follow it down. The jug's immense mass allowed it to reach incredible dive speeds, sometimes exceeding 525 miles per hour. German pilots who tried to follow often blacked out, lost control, or saw their wings shear away. The sky itself became the Thunderbolt's ally. Its armament, 8 Browning M2 machine guns, made it the most heavily armed fighter of its class. A 3-second burst could deliver over 100 rounds per gun, enough to disintegrate a bomber or rip apart a locomotive. For ground attack, it could carry 2,500 pounds of bombs or rockets, turning it into a fighter bomber of terrifying capability. By late 1943, Luftwaffe intelligence officers began warning that the American heavy fighter was not to be underestimated. They were watching a transformation, a shift from defensive escort to offensive hunter. When the Thunderbolt first appeared over France, Luftwaffe morale was high. German aces, many with over 100 kills, saw the large American fighter as easy prey. They mocked it in briefings and compared it to the slow twin-engine bombers they had once decimated. But reports from the front soon contradicted their confidence. Fightergruppen began losing aircraft to P-47s that attacked from impossible altitudes, diving through formations with overwhelming gunfire before vanishing into the clouds. The Thunderbolt's 50 caliber rounds tore through aluminum and flesh with industrial precision. German pilots quickly realized that trying to outturn the P-47 was pointless. The only way to survive was to strike from above and escape, the very tactic they had once used against the Allies. Some Luftwaffe aces began calling the Thunderbolt Der fliegende Panzer, the flying tank. It wasn't just the firepower that shocked them. It was the punishment the jug could take. There were stories of Thunderbolts returning home with engines barely holding together, oil streaming from holes the size of fists. One German ace reportedly said, "When you hit a P-47, you must hit it twice, once to break it and once more to make sure it knows." The psychological shift was visible in radio chatter. Where laughter and taunts once filled the airwaves, silence began to take their place. Luftwaffe units started avoiding large P-47 formations unless ordered to engage. The balance of confidence, the most vital weapon in aerial warfare, had begun to tilt. By late 1943, both sides understood that the Thunderbolt was no longer an experiment. It was a declaration, a promise that the skies over Europe would soon belong to the Allies. But there were still lessons to learn. The P-47's full potential hadn't yet been unleashed. Its pilots were still refining tactics, commanders were still studying data, and engineers were still modifying range tanks and weapons mounts. And in the coming months, these elements would fuse together, turning the Thunderbolt from a misunderstood giant into one of the deadliest machines of the entire war, the P-47. Thunderbolt was more than just metal and horsepower. It was a symbol of a new philosophy in air warfare. Its evolution reshaped American aerial tactics, morale, and the entire Allied approach to dominance in the skies. The second half of its story reveals how doctrine, psychology, and adaptability transformed this heavyweight machine into an apex predator of World War II. In the beginning, the Thunderbolt's purpose was simple: protect the bombers. American commanders envisioned tight defensive screens around B-17s and B-24s, repelling German fighters that tried to break through. But that tactic failed. The Luftwaffe was too skilled, too coordinated. P-47s tied to close escort duty couldn't use their speed or altitude advantage. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, recognized this flaw immediately. His pilots, some of the most aggressive in the USAF, were frustrated by passivity. Zemke changed everything. He ordered his squadrons to climb far above the bombers and attack the enemy before they reached the formation. Fast. Coordinated strikes followed by steep dives away from danger. It was a revolution in doctrine. Instead of waiting to react, the Thunderbolt would now hunt. Zemke's men, soon famous as Zemke's Wolf Pack, refined a new form of air combat. They operated in pairs and small flights, attacking and slashing high-speed dives and never lingering in turning fights. Their motto became "Hit hard, get out. Come back alive." The results were dramatic. Kill ratios soared and bomber losses dropped. German pilots found themselves constantly climbing into ambushes. Their once superior FW-190s outpaced in dives and torn apart by the Thunderbolt's gunfire. Soon, other groups adopted the method. The P-47 had become the perfect weapon for boom and zoom combat, the art of striking from the sun, overwhelming the enemy, and disappearing into the clouds before they could respond. What began as a clumsy escort fighter was now a terror of the high altitudes, the silent guardian above the bomber streams, invisible until it struck. War is fought not just with weapons but with belief. By late 1943, the Thunderbolt had begun to change the psychology of air combat on both sides. For American pilots, the P-47 was a fortress. They trusted it with their lives. Pilots who had survived being hit by 20mm cannon shells told newcomers, "This plane will take you home." That kind of faith made them bolder, more aggressive, more united. It also created a shared identity. Jug drivers, they called themselves, proud of the plane's ruggedness. Squadron artwork and nose art reflected it. Caricatures of bulldogs, gorillas, or boxers, heavy, unstoppable, and fearless. Meanwhile, for the Luftwaffe, the psychology was shifting in the opposite direction. Every German pilot knew that if a P-47 had the altitude advantage, the fight was lost before it began. The sound of its engine and that deep hammering roar became an omen. They began to dread that silhouette, the wide belly, the squared wings, the glint of sunlight off the canopy before a dive. German radio intercepts captured a growing anxiety. Pilots spoke of the big American that could outrun them, outclimb them at high altitude, and absorb bullets like armor. Confidence, once the Luftwaffe's greatest weapon, began to erode, and as fear grew, morale faltered. No weapon, no matter how advanced, succeeds without leadership. The Thunderbolt's rise was guided by commanders and engineers who refused to give up on it, even when it seemed too heavy, too slow, and too complex. Colonel Zemke was the face of that transformation, but he wasn't alone. Leaders like Colonel David Schilling and Francis Gaby Gabreski became living symbols of Thunderbolt mastery. Gabreski, a Polish-American ace, would go on to score 28 kills in Europe, all in a P-47. These men weren't just skilled pilots. They were tacticians, innovators, and teachers. They taught others to trust the aircraft's power, to use altitude and diving speed as weapons, and to rely on discipline over impulse. Their methods spread across the 8th Air Force, changing the way every fighter group operated. Meanwhile, back in the United States, Republic Aviation's engineers continued to evolve the design. The P-47D model, the Razorback, gave way to later variants with a bubble canopy for better visibility, larger drop tanks for extended range, and hard points for bombs and rockets. The Thunderbolt was no longer just a fighter. It was becoming a multi-role weapon. By the end of 1943, it was clear that the Thunderbolt had done more than silence the laughter of its enemies. It had taught the U.S. Army Air Forces how to fight, with technology, with aggression, and with overwhelming industrial power. Through these angles, human, technological, psychological, and doctrinal, the story of the P-47 became more than mechanical. It became personal. It was about courage meeting innovation, arrogance meeting resilience, and how underestimation can become a fatal flaw in war. The next chapter of the Thunderbolt's journey would be written not in training manuals or tactics briefings, but in fire. Over the fields and factories of Nazi Germany, the Luftwaffe's dominance was about to be challenged on every front, and the P-47 would lead the charge. By the summer of 1943, the skies over Western Europe had become a vast, lethal chessboard. The Luftwaffe still controlled the center, the air above Germany, Belgium, and northern France. But the Americans were moving in from the edges, step by calculated step. At the tip of that advance was the P-47 Thunderbolt. Its pilots had grown from cautious rookies into confident hunters. The 56th Fighter Group, now operating under Zemke's Wolfpack doctrine, was rewriting the rules of the air war. Their job was simple on paper: protect the bombers, but in practice, it was a daily battle for survival. The first major test came on August 17, 1943, the double strike on Regensburg and Schweinfurt. Hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses took off from English airfields before dawn, bound for deep targets in southern and central Germany. Their mission, to cripple German aircraft production, would mark one of the bloodiest days of the air war. Escorting them were Thunderbolts of the 4th and 56th Fighter Groups, tasked to guard the bomber stream as far as their fuel allowed. Zemke's pilots climbed high into the thin morning air, engines howling, their eyes scanning the horizon for the first signs of the Luftwaffe. They didn't have to wait long. Near the Belgian border, formations of Bf-109Gs and Fw-190As rose from the haze like swarming hornets. The Germans were ready. Over 300 fighters waited along the route, positioned for interception. At first, the Thunderbolts dove from altitude to break up the attack waves, their 50 caliber guns tearing into the formation. Dozens of dogfights erupted across the sky. The radio chatter was chaos. Bandits at 10 o'clock high. I've got one smoking. He's diving. I'm going with him. The Luftwaffe pilots were shocked by what they saw. The big American fighter, once mocked as a flying tank, could not only keep up in a dive, it could outrun them. Its bullets hit with terrifying force, and when a Thunderbolt was hit, it didn't explode when it kept flying, smoking, returning fire until the attacker broke off. By the time the P-47s turned back for fuel, their bombers continued alone toward Germany. Many would never return. 60 bombers were lost that day, but the Thunderbolt had proven something critical. It could stand toe-to-toe with the Luftwaffe and survive. From that moment, American command doubled down. More P-47s were sent overseas, and new versions were fitted with drop tanks that extended their range. With each passing week, the front line of the air war crept deeper into German-held territory. Then came the baptism of fire for Zemke's Wolfpack, a full-scale engagement near Emden, on the North Sea coast in late September 1943. That morning, 50 Thunderbolts took off under cloudy skies, climbing to 28,000 feet to intercept German fighters threatening the bombers. The Luftwaffe came at them head-on. Dozens of Fu-190s in tight formation. Confident as ever, Zemke's voice crackled over the radio. Wolfpack. Attack from the sun. The sky erupted, the Thunderbolts dove at full speed, the air screaming over their wings. Tracers streaked downward like burning rain. German formations scattered, caught completely off guard by the sheer ferocity of the dive attack. In seconds, 5 Fw-190s were down. Lieutenant Francis Gabreski, flying lead for one flight, described the moment later. I saw the German fighter's wings flash red as my guns hit. He rolled over once, then disintegrated. I had never seen a plane come apart so fast. The Wolfpack climbed again, reformed, and dove once more. It was an aerial hammer, precise, brutal, unstoppable. When the battle ended, Semke's men claimed over 25 kills for the loss of a single P-47. German radar operators tracking the fight reported fast-diving American fighters that attacked and vanished before interception could occur. The Luftwaffe had faced Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Mustangs, but never anything like this. The psychological impact was immediate. German high command issued new instructions. Avoid head-on engagements with Thunderbolts, engage only if altitude advantage was clear, and break off if the American fighters began to dive. The air war over Western Europe had shifted. For the first time, the hunter and the hunted had changed places, and yet this was only the beginning. In the months to come, the Thunderbolt would expand its reach, flying deeper into enemy territory than ever before. It would escort bombers to the heart of Germany, battle the Luftwaffe over its own airfields, and leave trails of burning aircraft across the continent. The laughter that once filled German ready rooms had fallen silent. Now, every pilot who saw that wide silver shape glinting in the sun knew what it meant. The jug was coming. Winter came hard to Europe in 1943. The skies turned gray, the airfields froze over, and still the missions went on. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the jug as its pilots now affectionately called it, became the workhorse of the Allied air offensive. Each morning before dawn, ground crews moved between rows of parked Thunderbolts, their breath visible in the cold air. They tightened bolts, checked guns, filled tanks, and wiped frost from propeller blades. By sunrise, engines thundered across the airfields of East Anglia, hundreds of roaring radial beasts preparing to launch into enemy skies. Inside their cockpits, pilots sat quietly in the glow of the instrument panel. Many carried a small photo taped near the gun sight, wives, girlfriends, or a lucky token from home. Some said a quick prayer. Then came the call. Thunderbolts, you are cleared for takeoff. And once again, the war in the air began. By early 1944, the Thunderbolt's transformation was complete. It was no longer just an escort fighter. It had become a high-altitude killer and a low-level destroyer in one. New drop tanks gave it the range to reach deep into Germany, while its 850 caliber Browning machine guns made it the most heavily armed single-engine aircraft in the world. Colonel Hub Zemke, now a legend in the 8th Air Force, kept pushing his men harder. His wolf pack had grown into one of the deadliest units of the war, credited with more than 500 confirmed kills by spring. They no longer waited for the Luftwaffe to find them. They went hunting. On February 20th, 1944, the Allies launched Operation Argument, later known as Big Week. The mission to cripple the German aircraft industry once and for all. Hundreds of American bombers attacked factories across Leipzig, Regensburg, and Augsburg. The Thunderbolts swept ahead, clearing the skies. It was during Big Week that Captain Robert S. Johnson, flying a P-47 named Lucky, earned his place in Thunderbolt legend. While escorting bombers near Hanover, Johnson's flight was ambushed by Focke-Wulf 190s. His aircraft was hit repeatedly. Cannon shells tore through the fuselage. Oil sprayed across the windshield and the canopy jammed shut. One 20mm shell exploded near his cockpit, blowing a hole in the side of the plane. He tried to bail out, but the canopy refused to open. With his controls half destroyed and his engine coughing smoke, Johnson was trapped. He turned the crippled Thunderbolt toward home, flying barely above the treetops. Then a German fighter appeared behind him. It was Major Egon Mayer, one of the Luftwaffe's top aces, flying an FW-190. Mayer moved in behind the wounded P-47 and began to fire, raking the American plane with bursts of cannon fire. Johnson's machine shuddered, holes appearing across its wings and tail. Still somehow it kept flying. For 5 full minutes. Mayer poured shells into the Thunderbolt. Over 200 hits were recorded later. And when the smoke cleared, the P-47 was still in the air. Mayer finally broke off, wagging his wings in salute before turning away. Johnson limped home, landing his ruined jug on one wheel. When ground crews counted the damage, they found 21 cannon shell impacts and 190 bullet holes. Yet not a single bullet had struck Johnson himself. That day, the myth of the indestructible Thunderbolt was born. By the spring of 1944, the air war over Europe had changed beyond recognition. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, was now fighting a desperate defensive campaign. Its veteran pilots were gone, lost to years of attrition, replaced by young recruits with barely 100 hours of flight time. Meanwhile, the Thunderbolt had evolved again. With its bomb racks fitted, it could now carry 2 500-pound bombs or 10 5-inch rockets. No longer just an escort, it became the hammer of ground attack, smashing German rail yards, convoys, and airfields ahead of the coming invasion. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, hundreds of Thunderbolts flew low over the beaches of Normandy. They strafed German bunkers, blew apart tanks, and cut supply lines behind enemy lines. Pilots could see the landing craft below, the tiny figures running across the sand, the smoke rising from the shoreline. It was chaos. It was history. And above it all, the P-47 roared, the sound of Allied air power unleashed. By late summer, the Thunderbolt ruled the skies. The Luftwaffe could still sting, but its days were numbered. Over the shattered fields of France, one German mechanic wrote in his diary, "When we see them coming, the fat ones with the silver wings, we know the day is lost." The Thunderbolts hunt everything. Trains, trucks, even men on bicycles. They own the sky now. The big fighter that once drew laughter from German pilots had become their nightmare. It was no longer the flying milk jug. It was the flying fortress's guardian, the Luftwaffe's executioner, and the steel thunder of liberation. By the time the summer of 1944 turned to autumn, the P-47 Thunderbolt had become one of the most feared sights in the European theater. What had started as a lumbering, misunderstood brute was now the cornerstone of Allied air dominance. After D-Day, the Thunderbolt squadrons shifted their role once again, from high-altitude escort to close air support, operating directly with ground troops as they pushed through France. The aircraft's massive engine and thick armor made it ideal for the brutal low-altitude missions, where smaller fighters like the P-51 struggled to survive. Every day, hundreds of Thunderbolts launched from temporary airfields built behind the advancing Allied front. These rough strips, carved out of farmland and forest, became home to the relentless rhythm of sortie after sortie. Mechanics worked around the clock, patching bullet holes and refueling with jerry cans. Pilots returned from missions blackened with smoke and sweat. Their planes often shredded but still flying. Their task was simple: destroy everything that moved behind German lines. Bridges, locomotives, armored columns, and fuel depots became daily targets. A single flight of Thunderbolts could cripple an entire supply route in minutes. The Germans learned to fear the distant growl of a radial engine. Soldiers on the ground would dive for cover at the first echo of that distinctive sound, the deep, rolling thunder that gave the aircraft its name. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was collapsing. Years of attrition, fuel shortages, and Allied bombing had broken its spine. Most of its aces were dead or captured. Many of its new pilots barely knew how to fly. In the skies over France, Belgium, and the Low Countries, Thunderbolts hunted almost uncontested. But that dominance came at a price. The ground attack missions were some of the most dangerous of the entire war. Anti-aircraft fire, machine guns, and small arms filled the air. Pilots who flew low enough to hit their targets were often flying straight into walls of lead. In November 1944, during the bitter battles in the Hürtgen Forest, P-47s of the 365th Fighter Group were tasked with destroying German artillery hidden among the trees. The weather was freezing, the visibility poor. Pilots flew through sheets of sleet and flak, often returning with holes the size of fists in their wings. Yet mission after mission, they went back up, because ground troops depended on them. The infantry would later recall how the Thunderbolts' attacks could turn the tide of an entire engagement. A squad pinned by enemy armor would hear the rumble above the forest, and moments later, rockets and .50 caliber fire would rip through the tree line, silencing the German guns. One soldier later wrote, "When we heard that thunder coming over the trees, we knew we weren't alone anymore." As the Allies pushed eastward toward the Rhine, the Thunderbolt's destructive power reached its peak. In early 1945, it helped obliterate what remained of German resistance in the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge. While blizzards initially grounded most aircraft, once the skies cleared, Thunderbolts unleashed their fury. Columns of retreating German armor were caught in open roads, easy prey for P-47s armed with rockets and bombs. Entire convoys were left smoldering in their wake. The Thunderbolt had become not just a fighter, but an aerial artillery piece, rewriting the doctrine of tactical air support. Even General George S. Patton, known for his impatience and ruthlessness, praised them publicly, saying, "The P-47s are the best damn weapon the Air Force ever gave me." As the war drew to a close, the P-47 story became a symbol of Allied endurance, a story of adaptation, grit, and brute force triumphing over refinement. It had started as a misunderstood experiment in American engineering, laughed at by both enemies and allies alike. Yet by 1945, it had destroyed over 7,000 enemy aircraft in the air, and thousands more on the ground. The Jug had done what few aircraft could claim. It dominated at high altitude, survived low-altitude hell, and brought countless pilots home alive. And still, its thunder was not yet silenced. The war in Europe was ending. But a new storm was already gathering in the Pacific. When Germany finally began to crumble in early 1945, the P-47 Thunderbolt was everywhere, soaring above the ruins of cities, streaking across valleys and prowling roads filled with retreating enemy columns. Allied armies now relied on them as their eyes and fists in the sky. From Holland to the Rhine, Thunderbolts operated with an almost mechanical relentlessness. Entire Luftwaffe airfields were annihilated before their planes could even take off. Fuel depots exploded into rolling black clouds. Bridges that had stood for centuries vanished under a rain of bombs and rockets. The Luftwaffe, reduced to fragments of its former power, threw everything it had left into the air. Jet fighters like the Me-262 appeared briefly, a glimpse of a new technological era, but there were too few of them, flown by pilots too inexperienced to change the outcome. Thunderbolt pilots who encountered the jets often described the encounters as terrifying but fleeting. One veteran, Lieutenant Francis Gabby Gabreski, the top American ace in Europe, recalled, "They were fast, but we owned the sky. You can't win a war with speed alone." By spring 1945, Allied forces crossed the Rhine. German towns fell one after another. On April 7th, the 56th Fighter Group flew one of its final combat missions over northern Germany, strafing enemy trains and armored vehicles near Bremen. Hours later, their commander, Colonel Hub Zemke, was captured after his Thunderbolt crash-landed during a mission. Even in captivity, he was respected by his enemies. The Germans knew his name. They'd heard the stories. When the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, hundreds of Thunderbolts stood lined up on airfields from England to Czechoslovakia. Some were scarred, patched with metal from dozens of battles. Others were brand new, never flown in combat. Ground crews who had spent years living beside them now stood quietly, watching the engines fall silent. The war that had defined the P-47 was over, but its journey was not. Even as Europe celebrated, the Pacific War still raged. American planners quickly realized the Thunderbolt's endurance and ruggedness made it perfect for the brutal conditions of the Pacific Islands. The aircraft was soon redeployed to bases in the Philippines, Okinawa, and Burma, where it continued to prove its worth. Against the Japanese, the P-47 became a hammer of destruction once again, smashing airfields, shipping lanes, and entrenched ground positions. Its massive engine gave it power in tropical heat where others struggled. Pilots in the Pacific often joked that the Jug could take a direct hit and keep coming back for seconds. In the China-Burma-India theater, it played a vital role in supporting Allied and Chinese forces. Its range, boosted by external tanks, allowed it to strike deep into enemy territory where few aircraft could reach. Japanese troops called it the Raiden Oni, the Thunder Demon. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, bringing the war to an end, many of those same Thunderbolts were already being prepared for what was expected to be a devastating invasion of Japan. That invasion never came, but if it had, the Jug would have led the way. After 1945, the world changed. The jet age arrived and piston engines faded into history. Yet the Thunderbolt refused to disappear quietly. Many nations continued to fly it for years after the war, in France, Brazil, Mexico, Turkey, and even post-war Italy. In some countries, it remained in service well into the 1950s, a testament to its reliability and power. In the United States, the P-47 was eventually succeeded by sleeker, faster jets, the P-80 Shooting Star, the F-84, and the F-86 Sabre. But among the veterans who had flown it, none ever forgot the Jug. It had carried them through the darkest days of the air war and brought them home. When logic said they shouldn't have survived, the Statistics told only part of the story. 1506-83 Thunderbolts built, over 7,000 enemy aircraft destroyed, and more than 1.5 million sorties flown. But the true legacy of the P-47 wasn't just in numbers. It was in the men who trusted it with their lives. When the guns finally fell silent, they left behind a legend written not in ink but in oil, smoke, and thunder. And as the war-torn skies cleared across Europe and Asia, the silence that followed was almost deafening, because for the first time in years the thunder had stopped. In the end, the story of the P-47 Thunderbolt was never just about machinery. It was about endurance. About men and metal that refused to break no matter how heavy the storm became. It was a weapon born from uncertainty, designed too big, too heavy, too late, they said. Yet it became the very sound of Allied air power, the deep growl of freedom sweeping across occupied Europe. Every line of its thick fuselage, every rumbling note of its Pratt & Whitney engine, spoke of brute strength over elegance, substance over style. The Germans had once mocked it, calling it the milk jug, the flying barrel, the clumsy beast. But when its 850 caliber guns began to thunder, the laughter died in the clouds for the men who flew it. The jug was more than an aircraft, and it was a guardian. It could take punishment that would have torn any other fighter apart. It could dive faster than the human body could endure. It was the machine that got you home when nothing else could. Across the airfields of England, Normandy and the Ardennes, pilots and mechanics came to know its sound before they saw it. That unmistakable, rolling thunder that meant help was coming. It was the sound of resilience. The war ended, but the lessons remained. The Thunderbolt proved that victory wasn't always about perfection. Sometimes it came from sheer power, reliability, and the courage to adapt. It was the bridge between eras, the last great piston engine titan before the dawn of the jet age. In museums today, its immense shape still dominates the hangars, a reminder of an age when the world's fate hung on wings of steel. Its metal skin bears the scars of 1,000 battles, but those scars tell the truth of its legacy. When German pilots laughed at the Thunderbolt, they saw only its size. They didn't understand that thunder doesn't need to be graceful. It only needs to strike once to be remembered forever. And the P-47 struck with the sound of history itself.